courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Judge Charles Hargrove, a man known for his sharp tongue and unwavering authority, presided over the afternoon session. The usual cases had passed without much fanfare: minor disputes, traffic violations, and civil infractions. Then, without warning, the energy in the room shifted. The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped in, her presence commanded attention. At just 27 years old, she was the youngest White House press secretary in history, a rising force in American politics. Dressed in her signature navy blue blazer, her small silver cross gleamed under the fluorescent lights. It was not a loud statement, not an act of defiance, just a quiet, personal symbol of faith. From the moment she took her seat, whispers rippled through the crowd. Some recognized her immediately, nudging each other in quiet excitement. Others simply sensed that something was different about her. She was here on official business, sent directly by President Trump to observe a case involving a religious discrimination lawsuit. It was routine, a simple fact-finding mission. But she had no idea that within moments, she would find herself at the center of the controversy. Judge Hargrove's gaze landed on her, his eyes narrowing behind thin, wire-rimmed glasses. His expression, at first indifferent, shifted into something sharper. He was a man who thrived on control, and something about Karoline seemed to challenge it without her even speaking a word. Then, his focus dropped to the small cross on her collar. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He tapped his gavel twice, leaning forward with an air of calculated authority. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice low but commanding. "I don't know how they do things at the White House, but in my courtroom, we maintain neutrality. That cross, take it off." The room fell into stunned silence. People exchanged glances, uncertain of what they had just heard. This wasn't a security issue. It wasn't a violation of dress code. There were no rules against religious symbols in court. Yet here was a federal judge, singling out the White House press secretary, demanding she remove a simple emblem of faith. Karoline didn't flinch. She sat up straighter, locking eyes with the judge. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was measured and clear. "Your Honor, I am here as an observer, not as a plaintiff or a defendant. My attire is professional and within all guidelines. The First Amendment protects my right to wear this cross." Judge Hargrove scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This is a court of law, not a place for religious displays. You want to represent the government? Then act like it. I am ordering you to remove it or face consequences." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The tension was palpable. Some in the audience seemed uncomfortable, others intrigued. This was no longer just about Karoline's cross. It was about power, control, and whether or not she would yield. Without hesitation, she responded, "With all due respect, Your Honor, the Supreme Court has already ruled on cases like this. The government cannot suppress religious expression without a compelling reason. If you are choosing to penalize me for exercising a constitutional right, I will need to request a legal justification." The judge's jaw tightened. He had not expected resistance, certainly not from someone so young. He banged his gavel, his voice rising. "Enough. You are in contempt of court. I am issuing a fine of $500. Pay it before you leave." Gasps echoed through the room. A few reporters in the back scribbled furiously, sensing the weight of the moment. Karoline, however, remained perfectly still. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and placed it on the table in front of her. "I will pay the fine, Your Honor," she said evenly. "But I am also officially documenting this violation of constitutional rights, and I will be taking the necessary steps to ensure that this does not happen again." A shift occurred in the courtroom, an unspoken understanding that something far bigger than a simple fine had just begun. Judge Hargrove had intended to exert his authority, to make an example out of her. Instead, he had ignited a battle he was woefully unprepared for. Karoline Leavitt was not just any government official. She was someone who knew the law, knew the system, and knew exactly how to fight back. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the shift in the courtroom. He had expected compliance. He had expected Karoline to back down, to quietly remove the cross and let the matter rest. Instead, she had done something far more dangerous. She had challenged him, not with anger or defiance, but with precise knowledge of the law. The murmurs in the room grew louder, reporters in the back already typing away, knowing this was no longer just another routine case. This was the kind of moment that could ignite national headlines. Karoline remained calm, her hands folded neatly on the desk in front of her. She wasn't rattled. If anything, she seemed prepared for this. Judge Hargrove, however, wasn't finished. He tapped his gavel again, this time more forcefully, as if trying to reassert his authority over a situation already slipping from his grasp. "Miss Leavitt," he said, voice sharp, "you are dangerously close to escalating this situation further. This court operates under strict neutrality. Religious symbols are divisive, and I will not have them disrupting proceedings. I have given my order. You will comply." Karoline didn't waver. She exhaled slowly, then spoke with measured precision. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that is not how neutrality works. If your court is truly neutral, then it should not single out religious expression for suppression. The First Amendment explicitly protects freedom of religion. The Supreme Court has reaffirmed this multiple times, most notably in Tinker v. Des Moines and Church of Lukumi Babalu I v. City of Hialeah. The government, including the judiciary, cannot restrict religious expression without demonstrating a compelling reason." The weight of her words settled over the room. A few of the attorneys sitting in the gallery exchanged glances. They knew she was right. The law was clear. But Judge Hargrove was not a man accustomed to being questioned. His lips curled into a thin smirk. "You think quoting case law at me is going to change my ruling?" "It's not about changing your ruling," Karoline replied smoothly. "It's about making it clear that this ruling is unconstitutional. If you fine me, that becomes part of the public record. If you continue to enforce an illegal order, it opens the door for an appeal. And if you're seen as targeting religious individuals unfairly, that is a direct violation of federal discrimination laws." The judge's smirk faltered. He wasn't dealing with a defiant activist. He was dealing with a legal mind trained at the highest levels of government, someone who understood not just her rights, but the full implications of his overreach. And now the entire courtroom was watching to see what he would do next. He could double down, risk turning this into a full-blown legal scandal. Or he could back off, knowing that any further action would be scrutinized by the media, the legal community, and possibly even the federal government. The silence stretched between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on the room. Then, in an attempt to save face, Judge Hargrove exhaled sharply, gripping his gavel tighter. "I will not engage in a legal debate with you, Miss Leavitt," he said curtly. "The fine stands. If you wish to challenge it, you are welcome to take the matter up with the appellate court." Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. He was retreating, not in words, but in posture. He was trying to assert his authority, but he had already lost control of the narrative. She nodded once, reached for her phone, and calmly typed out a message. Within moments, a reporter in the back of the courtroom received a notification. A single tweet from Karoline Leavitt had just gone live. "Federal judge fines White House press secretary for wearing a cross in court. Clear violation of First Amendment rights. We will not be silent." Religious freedom. The story had just gone national. The courtroom remained silent, but outside its walls, the internet had already erupted. Karoline's tweet spread like wildfire, gaining traction within minutes. Conservative commentators picked it up first, blasting Judge Hargrove's actions as an attack on religious freedom. Within the hour, legal experts began weighing in, some supporting Karoline's stance, others arguing that the judge had the authority to regulate courtroom decorum. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a minor courtroom dispute anymore. It had become a national conversation. Judge Hargrove's face tightened as he glanced at his court clerk, who was discreetly checking her phone. He could see it in her eyes. The moment he feared had arrived. The courtroom doors remained shut, but he could already imagine the reporters gathering outside, cameras rolling, headlines being drafted. Karoline remained seated, her demeanor unshaken. She had known this would happen the moment she sent out that tweet. She wasn't just defending herself. She was sending a message to every person of faith who had ever felt silenced. The gavel might belong to the judge, but the power of the narrative was hers. Outside the courthouse, conservative media outlets had mobilized in full force. Fox News ran a breaking news banner. White House press secretary fined for religious symbol. Legal battle begins. Ben Shapiro released an immediate reaction video titled, "Judge tries to silence Christianity. This is unconstitutional." On the other side, liberal commentators scrambled to control the damage. CNN's legal analysts tried to spin it as a non-issue, claiming that religious neutrality was an important part of the judicial system. MSNBC ran a segment questioning whether Karoline was using the incident to stir controversy. But the public wasn't buying it. Thousands of tweets flooded social media, many from ordinary citizens sharing their own stories of feeling pressured to hide their faith in professional settings. Hashtags like "Cross to Religious Freedom," "Cross in Court," and "Leavitt v. Hargrove" trended nationwide. By the end of the day, even politicians had joined the debate. Several Republican lawmakers issued statements condemning Judge Hargrove's decision. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis tweeted, "No judge has the right to strip an American of their First Amendment freedoms. Karoline Leavitt is standing up for every person of faith in this country." Texas Senator Ted Cruz went even further. If a judge thinks he can fine a woman for wearing a cross, what's next? Will he start banning prayer altogether? This is an outrageous abuse of power. Back in the courtroom, Judge Hargrove clenched his jaw, realizing that he was now the center of a national controversy. He had thought that fining Karoline would be a simple exercise in authority, a momentary exertion of control. Instead, he had ignited a political and legal firestorm that threatened to consume his career. A tense conversation was already unfolding behind the scenes. The courthouse's administrative office had been flooded with calls from journalists and legal representatives demanding comment. The Judicial Ethics Committee had been notified. Even federal agencies were beginning to take notice. Karoline remained seated, her expression unreadable. She knew exactly what was happening outside those doors, and she knew that this was no longer just about her. This was about every person who had ever been told to keep their faith hidden, every individual who had been forced to choose between their beliefs and their profession. She glanced down at her phone, where a text from a senior White House official had just come in. "President Trump is watching. He wants you to know. You did the right thing." Her eyes flickered with quiet determination. Judge Hargrove, still gripping his gavel, had no idea that the real battle had just begun. The weight of the situation finally began to settle in Judge Hargrove's mind. What had started as a simple act of judicial authority, fining a press secretary for wearing a cross, had escalated into a nationwide controversy. His courtroom was no longer just a local legal venue. It had become the focal point of a political and constitutional crisis. As the day unfolded, pressure mounted from every direction. The courthouse received a flood of calls from legal watchdog groups demanding an explanation for his actions. The American Center for Law and Justice, ACLJ, issued a formal complaint, accusing Judge Hargrove of religious discrimination. Meanwhile, Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, announced that they were preparing legal action to challenge the fine as an unconstitutional violation of Karoline's rights. Hargrove's legal team advised him to remain silent, but behind closed doors, he was already in damage control mode. He had never anticipated that a minor contempt fine would draw the attention of the White House, conservative media, and civil rights attorneys all in the same day. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Karoline Leavitt remained composed. She had expected pushback, but what she didn't expect was just how quickly the system would react. The D.C. Judicial Ethics Committee had announced an internal review of Hargrove's actions, citing concerns over impartiality and possible violations of judicial conduct. By mid-afternoon, White House officials had begun weighing their options. Karoline's direct supervisor, Trump's senior communications advisor, placed a call to the Department of Justice, inquiring about the legal grounds for the judge's decision. The response was clear. The judge was on thin ice. Outside the courthouse, protesters had begun gathering. Supporters of religious freedom held signs reading, "Faith is not a crime," and "Hands off the First Amendment." Their presence underscored the deeper issue at play. This was no longer about Karoline's cross. It was about the growing perception that public officials were being targeted for their faith. Inside the judge's chambers, the tension was unbearable. A phone call from his superior at the D.C. Court of Appeals was short, but brutal. "Charles, you need to issue a public clarification. This is spiraling out of control." Judge Hargrove exhaled sharply, gripping the receiver. "A clarification? You want me to apologize?" The voice on the other end was firm. "You don't have a choice. There's talk of a formal judicial review. If you dig in, this could end your career." Hargrove slammed the phone down, his jaw tightening. He had spent decades building his reputation, carefully navigating the political landscape of D.C.'s legal system. Now, in a matter of hours, it was unraveling before his eyes. Meanwhile, Karoline was already preparing for her next move. She had spent years mastering the art of political strategy, and she knew that moments like these weren't just about defending yourself. They were about shaping the larger narrative. Her team had already drafted a statement for release. It read, "Religious freedom is not negotiable. I wore my cross today, as I do every day, not to make a statement, but because it is a part of who I am. No American should ever be forced to hide their faith. The First Amendment protects all of us, regardless of belief. I will not back down." The statement was sent to every major news outlet, instantly amplifying the pressure on Hargrove. Within minutes, Fox News ran a breaking news segment, reading Karoline's words on air. The segment ended with a stark warning from a legal expert. If this case escalates, it could land in federal court. The judge's actions were not just improper, they were unconstitutional. By evening, the conversation had reached another level. The White House Correspondents Association issued a statement condemning any attempts to restrict journalists' personal rights in government spaces. Even some liberal commentators admitted that the fine appeared excessive. For Judge Hargrove, the reality was clear. He was losing control. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., his phone buzzed with an urgent email from the Judicial Ethics Committee. Subject: Immediate response required. Judicial conduct review initiated. Hargrove's hand trembled as he clicked the email open. He could already see where this was heading. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just fighting back, she was winning. Judge Hargrove sat in his office, the weight of his career pressing down on him. The Judicial Ethics Committee had officially launched an investigation. News outlets were running segments questioning his impartiality, and the White House had made it clear that they would not let this go. His once untouchable authority was now crumbling beneath him. With no other options, Hargrove made a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. Early the next morning, His office released a public statement claiming that his fine against Karoline was a misunderstanding and that it was never about restricting religious expression. He insisted that the fine was issued due to courtroom decorum violations, not because of Karoline's cross. But it was too late. Karoline saw through the weak attempt at damage control and was ready with her next move. As the media buzzed over Hargrove's response, she scheduled a press conference in front of the courthouse, where it had all started. Reporters gathered, cameras rolled, and the nation watched. Stepping up to the podium, Karoline exuded confidence. She held up the original fine receipt for everyone to see, her voice clear and unwavering. The judge's statement says this was about courtroom decorum. But if that were true, why weren't others in that room, wearing t-shirts with slogans, oversized jewelry, or other personal expressions, given the same fine? She let the silence hang for a moment, then continued. This wasn't about decorum. This was about targeting religious expression, and if we let this slide, where does it stop? Her words sent a shockwave through the media. Even neutral journalists had to admit that she had a point. The evidence was there. The disparity in treatment was undeniable. By the end of the press conference, social media erupted. The hashtag number Religious Freedom Matters began trending, fueled by thousands of posts supporting Karoline's stance. Conservative commentators hailed her as a fighter for constitutional rights, while even some moderate voices acknowledged that Judge Hargrove's decision was indefensible. With the pressure mounting, the judge received the final blow, a formal summons from the D.C. Judicial Review Board. He was officially being investigated for misconduct. Karoline had not only defended herself, she had turned the tables on the very system that tried to silence her. As news of the Judicial Review Board's investigation spread, Judge Hargrove's once unshakable authority crumbled overnight. His courtroom, once a place where he ruled with unquestioned power, was now under scrutiny from legal experts, journalists, and the public. Hargrove initially tried to defend himself, appearing in a brief TV interview where he claimed he had been misunderstood and that his actions were about maintaining the dignity of the courtroom. But it backfired. When asked directly why others in the courtroom had not received similar fines, he stumbled over his words, failing to provide a coherent answer. The media saw right through it. Karoline, on the other hand, remained poised and unshaken. While the judge struggled to contain the firestorm, she was expanding the conversation. She didn't just make it about herself. She made it about every American's right to religious expression. She appeared on national news networks, calmly explaining how her case was just one example of a growing issue where faith-based individuals were being unfairly silenced. Legal scholars weighed in, citing her case as a turning point for First Amendment discussions. The White House saw an opportunity and seized it. President Trump's team drafted an official statement emphasizing the administration's commitment to religious freedom. The D.C. Judicial Review Board announced that due to mounting evidence and public interest, they were expanding their inquiry into Judge Hargrove's past cases, searching for patterns of bias. What they found was damning. Hargrove had a history of issuing steep fines for religious symbols and expressions, while ignoring clear violations of courtroom decorum from others. Over the past 2 years, nearly 80% of the fines related to personal attire in his courtroom had been directed at Christians and other religious individuals. With this evidence in hand, legal experts called for his resignation. The pressure became unbearable. Hargrove was now the face of judicial overreach, a judge who had let personal bias cloud his decisions. Within 48 hours, the D.C. Judicial Review Board made its ruling. Hargrove was suspended pending further investigation. For Karoline, this wasn't just a victory. It was a reckoning. She hadn't just defended herself. She had exposed a system that had been hiding in plain sight. With Judge Hargrove suspended, the impact of Karoline's fight spread far beyond Washington, D.C. What had started as a single courtroom confrontation had now evolved into a national discussion on religious freedom, judicial bias, and the power of standing up for one's beliefs. Social media exploded with support. The hashtag #CrossInCourt surged to the #1 trending topic on X. Conservatives, religious organizations, and free speech advocates rallied behind Karoline, praising her for exposing what they called a double standard in the legal system. Her refusal to back down resonated deeply with millions of Americans who had witnessed similar bias in their own lives. Mainstream media outlets were forced to cover the story. Some tried to downplay it, calling it an overreaction or a political stunt. But the video footage didn't lie. The courtroom exchange, captured on hidden recordings and later leaked online, showed Hargrove's condescending tone and unfair application of the rules. The public wasn't buying any attempt to spin it. Legal experts weighed in, debating the constitutional implications of the case. Karoline was invited to speak on major news networks, where she calmly laid out her argument. This wasn't about politics. It was about fundamental rights. She cited landmark Supreme Court cases that protected religious expression, shutting down any opposition with cold, hard legal facts. Meanwhile, the D.C. Judicial Review Board expanded their investigation, digging into Hargrove's past rulings. Reports surfaced that he had dismissed cases involving explicitly offensive attire, yet had aggressively fined individuals for wearing small religious symbols. The hypocrisy was undeniable. The fallout reached the highest levels of government. Conservative members of Congress called for wider judicial oversight, demanding stricter measures to prevent bias in the courtroom. Even those who didn't initially support Karoline's stance were now forced to acknowledge the legal precedent she had set. Back at the White House, President Trump seized the moment, issuing a formal statement praising Karoline's actions. He declared, "No American should ever be punished for their faith. The Constitution guarantees it, and today, Karoline Leavitt reminded the nation why that matters." The momentum was undeniable. Karoline had not only defended herself, she had triggered a movement. One courtroom decision had sent shockwaves across the country, and there was no stopping it now. As the national uproar continued, Judge Hargrove found himself at the center of a growing scandal. The D.C. Judicial Review Board formally suspended him, pending a full investigation. But the pressure didn't stop there. Calls for his resignation echoed across legal circles, conservative media, and even among his own peers. For years, Hargrove had operated unchecked, making rulings that many now saw as clear examples of judicial overreach. Now, under intense scrutiny, old cases were being re-examined. More individuals came forward, sharing their experiences of being unfairly fined or dismissed for displaying religious symbols in his courtroom. The pattern of bias was undeniable. Public opinion turned sharply against him. Some legal analysts on mainstream networks attempted to defend Hargrove, arguing that he had simply been trying to maintain courtroom neutrality. But those arguments fell flat as court transcripts, witness testimonies, and video evidence flooded the internet, revealing a clear double standard. Hargrove had been selective with his enforcement, punishing religious expression while allowing blatantly inappropriate attire to pass without question. Under immense pressure, Hargrove finally broke his silence. In a brief, defensive statement to reporters, he insisted he had acted within the bounds of judicial discretion, but admitted that perhaps he had been too strict in his rulings on religious symbols. His words did little to help his case. The damage was already done. The final blow came when the D.C. Judicial Council announced a full internal review of court policies regarding religious freedom. The council declared that moving forward, no judge would be permitted to fine or penalize individuals solely for displaying religious symbols unless it directly disrupted proceedings. It was a massive policy shift, one that Karoline Leavitt had single-handedly forced into motion. Meanwhile, conservative lawmakers saw an opportunity to take the fight nationwide. Several members of Congress introduced new legislation aimed at protecting religious expression in all federal and state courtrooms. Karoline's confrontation had sparked a legal movement, one that aimed to reshape how religious freedom was treated in American courts. As Hargrove faced possible removal from the bench, Karoline had cemented her place in history. She had walked into a courtroom expecting to observe a case. Instead, she had become the case, and in doing so, changed the system forever. Karoline Leavitt had not set out to make history that day. She had simply walked into the courtroom to observe a legal proceeding on behalf of the White House. But when faced with blatant judicial overreach, she did not back down. She stood her ground, fought with the law, and exposed a deeply rooted bias that had been operating in plain sight for years. Her actions had ripple effects far beyond that courtroom. The national conversation around religious freedom, judicial fairness, and constitutional rights had been reignited. Millions of Americans who had felt silenced or dismissed for their faith now had a new champion in Karoline Leavitt. The viral footage of her calmly dismantling Judge Hargrove's arguments had become a symbol of defiance against overreaching authority. The impact was immediate. Federal and state courts across the country began reviewing their own policies on religious expression. Conservative leaders rallied behind new protections to ensure no judge could ever repeat what Hargrove had done. Meanwhile, mainstream media struggled to contain the narrative, attempting to downplay Karoline's victory. But the footage, the evidence, and the public outcry were too overwhelming to ignore. For Judge Hargrove, his career was effectively over. His suspension turned into a full resignation, and his name became a cautionary tale about what happens when personal bias overrides the Constitution. The legal community took note. No judge was above the law. Karoline, on the other hand, emerged stronger than ever. She was no longer just the youngest White House press secretary in history. She was now a symbol of unwavering strength, sharp intellect, and unshakable faith. And as she returned to the White House that evening, her silver cross still glimmering on her blazer, she knew this was just the beginning. Because when you stand up for what is right, you do not just win battles, you change the system forever.